The thing that makes it difficult being someone who believes in evidence-based policy is too often the folks who question you on that say, well, how did this thing change? You said it was evidence-based one year, not the next. And getting folks to realize the scientific method and that process of inquiry isn't about coming up with the permanent, unalterable truth. It's about constantly probing and looking for flaws and weaknesses in what you do, examining your own processes and the way you handle problems, and looking for better ways to get things done.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/The Rational View. Together, we can make a better future. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, I'm interviewing the leader of a new Canadian political party, the Canadian Future Party. Their website has the following statement that I quite liked. The CFP believes people from every corner of the country want to be united behind a common set of ideals: democracy, the rule of law, collective action, and individual rights. A country where you can live as you like, love who you want. In exchange, you work hard and we collectively agree on a common set of rules to let us live our different lives together, where decisions are based on evidence. That sounds like they've been listening to my podcast. If you enjoy what you're hearing, please press like in your podcast app, and I'd love to hear from you on my Facebook group, The Rational View. Dominic Cardy is the leader of the Canadian Future Party. Dominic brings a wealth of experience in international affairs and Canadian politics, having served as Minister of Education and then as an independent MLA, committed to public service and policy innovation. Born in the UK and raised in Fredericton, Dominic was elected as the Progressive Conservative MLA for Fredericton West-Hanwell in 2018 and re-elected in 2020. He served as Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development until 2022. He holds a BA in Political Science from Dalhousie University. His career spans roles with the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs, the National Democratic Institute, and the Forum of Federations, working across Asia and Africa. He also led the New Brunswick NDP from 2011 to 2016 and served as Chief of Staff to the Leader of the Opposition from 2017 to 2018. Additionally, Dominic has been a flying instructor since 1994 and is a member of the editorial board of Inroads, a Canadian policy journal. Mr. Cardy, welcome to The Rational View.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on the show.
I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. So you've been a politician for quite some time, over a decade now. Can you give us a background of your career? What are you most proud of accomplishing during this time?
Proud of accomplishing would be when I was education minister, a couple of things. First was, given the name of your show, I think this will appeal. We had a really weird situation in Canada and the US for the last number of decades where we stopped teaching kids how to read. So there was a number of non-scientific approaches to literacy instruction. And this has actually led in Ontario to an Ontario Human Rights Commission complaint that saying that Ontario's children were being denied the right to an education because they weren't being taught to read. So New Brunswick was the first Canadian province when I was minister to introduce a scientific approach to literacy. And the results of that, you talk about a way to change people's lives. You teach someone to read, their life expectancy, their lifetime income expectancy, everything goes up in an order of magnitude that's hard to achieve with any other input that's as simple as teaching someone to read. It can only take a few months to get the foundations down. So I became sort of obsessed with literacy and education as the foundations for democracy when I was working for the National Democratic Institute, an American democracy promotion NGO. Okay. And I lived in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, places like that. And I really saw that unless you can read and write, you can't contribute in a democracy. Because you can be conned by so many people. You can be conned by people writing dishonest election platforms, bad financial deals, loan agreements, mortgages, and everything else. So democracy, I think, has got to be linked to literacy a lot more. And that gets back to education. And I think we've seen the last few weeks in politics, education is pretty important.
So you're talking about, I assume, like teaching of phonics versus teaching of word recognition. Is that the sort of basis of the crux of the issue here that you're talking about, or is it something deeper?
Yeah, that's the heart of it. Is so the scientific approach to reading is structured literacy, and it includes a lot of the sort of the softer approaches that were used around literacy instruction in recent decades, but puts understanding the words and how they're built back at the heart of literacy instruction. It was dropped because it was felt that it was both disengaging for students and that the evidence wasn't there decades ago. The evidence has shifted dramatically. And I think that's the thing that makes it difficult being someone who believes in evidence-based policies. Too often the folks who question you on that say, well, how did this thing change? You said it was evidence-based one year, not the next. And getting folks to realize that the scientific method and that process of inquiry isn't about coming up with the permanent, unalterable truth. It's about constantly probing and looking for flaws and weaknesses in what you do, examining your own processes and the way you handle problems, and looking for better ways to get things done. So in this case, the big change came with development in neuroscience, which had been kind of separate from education, because education and teaching had long been shunted to one side and treated in a less scientific, less rigorous way. And so the education fields had really missed out on some of the developments in neuroscience that were really showing how language acquisition was something that really needs that explicit instruction for most kids to get the grasp of it. A small percentage learn to read without any formal instruction through a process that is still not properly understood, and we don't have a scientific explanation for it yet. But for over 80% of young people, if you don't give explicit instruction, you're holding them back. And obviously that creates massive problems in terms of discipline in classrooms, not being able to learn anything else. Because if you can't read and you have an entire school system based on reading, you're leaving a lot of children behind from a really young age for no reason at all, except for a lack of attention to evidence-based policy.
Reading is fundamental. Your bio says that you led the New Brunswick NDP, but also served as a Progressive Conservative MLA. These two parties seem to be at opposing ends of the political spectrum on fiscal policy. Seems like quite a swing. Why the big change?
There wasn't one for me. I've always been basically what you would, a lot of people traditionally call, I don't think the labels left, right, are too useful anymore, but a right-wing social democrat. That I believe in personal freedom. People should have the right to live and enjoy their life as much as they can. But we do absolutely have obligations to each other. Humans are social animals. We live in large, complex groups. We need large, complex structures to keep us alive and happy if we want to enjoy the many benefits of living in an industrial or post-industrial world. So on the one hand, I think fiscal discipline is something that should be at the heart of any political project, because if you can't pay for the programs you're offering, then how are you being responsible? I think that's often where the left has really fallen down, by explaining how they'll pay for the things that they promise, and also explaining how they will actually deliver results. So my personal political journey was I'd been a sort of right-wing social democrat from the time I was a teenager, became increasingly frustrated with the embrace of non-evidence-based sort of culture war tactics from the U.S., allowing people into the NDP who were openly espousing Marxism, for example, and a number of other areas where I just felt that the party had really gone off the rails. So I left. And in New Brunswick had a Progressive Conservative leader who initially promised to follow the evidence. And he was personally much more right-wing than I am on social issues. He comes from a Baptist family background. But we had an agreement across the party, inside the Progressive Conservatives, that we wouldn't talk about those issues, that it would be focusing on getting results, making our social programs deliver. And in the 2018 to 2020 New Brunswick government, which was a minority, we got things done that didn't even seem possible before that. We balanced the budget right away and invested more in healthcare and education. And then when COVID hit, we were the only place in the entire world that created the equivalent of an all-party government. We had a COVID cabinet committee that included leaders from the other political parties, and we would sit and manage the pandemic together, which was one of the reasons New Brunswick had one of the best COVID experiences in the world. 18 months of the pandemic.
Yeah,
but like a lot of other people are.
In terms of physical or economy, this is something I've delved into a little bit in previous podcasts, and trying to understand what is the evidential basis for modeling of different approaches to the economy, and I can't find any really good hard evidence. It seems like we have this political divergence between neoliberalism on the one hand and say at the other extreme modern monetary theory. and none of these are based on facts, as far as I can tell, or good. Like, nobody can point me to a model that says this is how an economy works. So, I'm very skeptical of both ends of the spectrum at this point. Do you have a particular evidence base that you turn to for monetary policy, or how do you justify your particular bent in terms of economy?
Well, I share your frustration with those two extremes, which is why I'm putting myself into the position of leading a brand new political party, which has got to be can't be too many more masochistic projects in politics. But I think one of the reasons we're seeing that sort of sterile debate on the left and the old left and the old right is because it's a dead end. We've had 150 years now of modern advanced economies grappling with how much of the economy should be controlled by the government, how many services should be delivered collectively versus individuals' rights to pursue their own goals and dreams and ambitions based on using their own cash. So we can absolutely see what's worked. We can see that the countries that veered generally over 40% or so of total taxation levels, they start to see diminishing outcomes. The ones that drop below a certain level see diminishing outcomes as well. But there's a clear sweet spot that you can see. If you just take a map of the world right now and point to any country, the GDP of that country is going to be, unless it's a petrostate, nearly always connected to the political institutions and the values that that country holds. And so I think, first off, when we're talking about evidence, we got to recognize that evidence starts off with values, and that I don't care if someone can provide me with 100% guaranteed scientific evidence that white people are less intelligent than other races. I don't care, because I have an ideological commitment to equality that means I'll accept distortions in my economic modeling in order to have a decent society. And I think that's where people on the sort of money-obsessed right have gone off the rails, is they just look at maximizing value and forget that there isn't much value if we're all fighting each other living in our own little cave.
So you've started a new federal party, as you mentioned, and we should maybe talk about this. It seems to be committed to being fiscally responsible and socially liberal. The Progressive Conservatives used to occupy this political quadrant before joining the Socially Conservative Reform Party at the Unite the Right back in 2003. Are you basically trying to rebuild the Progressive Conservatives at the federal level?
No, that's a really good question, because that's one that we get asked a lot. And a lot of people ask that hoping that the answer is going to be yes, because a lot of people like that approach. I don't think that approach works, because it's, again, trapped in a 19th and 20th century model of societal analysis. Our left-right spectrum evolved in the face of the Industrial Revolution. We are now past that. And we, again, now have 100 plus years of experience of managing complex, liberal, small L liberal, democratic states. We have an idea of what works and doesn't work when it comes to the economy. We have no parties out there actively pushing for what is demonstrated based on evidence to work, because the left-wing parties want to embrace a whole lot of commitments to programs that don't have evidence base to support. And so do the folks on the right, because they're both carrying on an ideological package that really, I think, has outlived its usefulness. So I don't want to be the leader of a new Progressive Conservative Party, because that party doesn't have anything to offer in terms of how do we deal with the challenge that most Canadians are not living in Canadian spaces anymore in nearly all of their waking hours, that they're online in spaces that are inherently non-geographic, and in our case, nearly always dominated by the US. Our conversations about media laws and access are meaningless in a country where nearly all of us are online with Americans and we can't tell each other apart. We can certainly see that during election campaigns, the number of emails I've had from people asking me about my thoughts on the Second Amendment and who confuse our Charter of Rights with the American one. It's there's a need for civics. That's another story. But I think that those challenges, what are we going to do with artificial intelligence, the possibility of machines being able to make human life better, but also there's a reasonable possibility that this time next year we'll have human level plus intelligence and the technology for that in the control of entirely unaccountable American billionaires who've just seen a questionable impact on the political process. So I think there are so many brand new challenges that we don't have Soviet model communism to worry about anymore, but we do have Chinese style statist autocracy, which is busy expanding its model. Anne Applebaum's recent book, Autocracy Inc., is excellent on this, talking about how Those guys don't care about whether or not you're a Muslim extremist or a Christian extremist or anything else. The Iranians and the Russians and the Chinese, all they want is a shared agreement by leaders of other states that they will not support human rights, they will not defend the rights of individuals, and that they will work together against the countries that do. So all of those challenges are completely new, and efforts to try and place them into a 19th century left-right and analytical framework constantly fail, which is why we're losing. We've got to get back to the idea that what we have right now in Western countries, democratic countries, is unequaled in the history of the world in terms of the wealth and opportunities that everyone has. And there are absolutely flaws and problems that we face, but there is nothing that we can't solve. We've solved more problems in the last 100 years than in the entire history of our species on this planet. And the fact that our enemies, who themselves have managed to only attain some level of wealth because they've stolen our intellectual property, for them to have managed to make us so incredibly demoralized and depressed that we don't think we can do anything in the face of, take Russia, for example, like a country that wastes its money on nuclear weapons when it has an economy smaller than Canada's. So trying to hold on to that sort of spirit that led to a drive towards both innovation, traditionally seen as being right-wing, and equality, traditionally seen as being left, they go together. So we need a political project that sees no contradiction in looking out for those who are less able to care for themselves and striving for excellence and competition, because that makes us more money. And the more money we have, the more we can run it into programs that actually deliver results for Canadians. So having that analysis, I think, is really what my party is offering in terms of a shift in an approach.
I've looked at your website, your Canadian Future Party website, and it highlights 5 policy nuggets on the website. And maybe you could go through some of these and maybe give a little introduction as to what your positions are on these issues. Your number 1 nugget was Canadian values and better government, in which it mentions democracy and an open society, defined individual rights and collective responsibilities. What changes do you propose to improve governance?
So first, I have to give a caveat that we're about to start our founding convention tomorrow evening, and we've got a bunch of resolutions that are on the table on some of these issues. And one of the things I've done my best to make sure is that our constitution, our bylaws, and a new party reflect the will of as many of the members of the party as possible. So I won't have the ability just to make up policies on the fly whenever I feel like it, which is increasingly something that
you can't now,
as parties become replaced by the leaders. So putting that to one side, but a couple of concrete things that I'm quite sure are going to be embraced. The first is we need to actually have a conversation about Canadian values. That's a language that's been appropriated by the old traditional right. Canada's values are a country that is open to the world, open to different ideas, but those ideas do need to be defined and limited as being within a liberal democratic framework. And I think that we have benefited for a long time by our geographic isolation, that we've been able to live somewhat immune to the world's crises and problems. I think that era is done. So we better figure out how we defend multiculturalism as a Canadian value, because otherwise we're in the weird position of being the only country that can't have a value in its culture. I hear that from far too many people on the left who will embrace anyone else's culture. But if it's something you identify as Canadian, it's dismissed as being somehow white, male, patriarchal. That's not us. We spent the last 60 years building a country that's more diverse than nearly anything in the history of this planet. We figured out how to harness the nuclear energy of multiculturalism and put it into a reactor building. We're seeing the last couple of years, if you don't handle the maintenance on that building properly, you start to get radioactive leaks. You've got to make sure that you're very clear about what your country stands for. And I think that people who came here for a long time had a very clear understanding. It was just Canadians who I think kind of lost track of that. So having that conversation, and I'm not trying to prejudge where that should go, except to say that mine and my party's contribution would be that we need the rule of law, as few laws as possible, strictly enforced, a clear discussion around collective responsibility versus individual rights. It has to happen at the community level. It can't just be governments ordering people to speak a certain way, to do or not do things. I think that's we're seeing the consequences of that sort of approach in the re-election or election again of Mr. Trump down south. We have to be very careful about not creating two societies. Very easy in an era of social media where a cosmopolitan elite separates away from the mass of the population, who increasingly don't see the benefit of a society that they don't feel offers them as much as it used to. So having that conversation, that's very high level. A couple of concrete
Sure.
things. We copied our parliamentary system from the Brits. In the UK, if you're elected as a member of parliament, you can vote against your party on pretty much any bill you want every day. And it's the job of the leader to go out and win a coalition of support to pass legislation or oppose legislation that they like or don't like every single vote. Canada took the British system and just deleted that part. It's not written down anywhere. But of course, Canada has the most centralized Westminster parliamentary system on earth, where our leaders have enormous and totally unacceptable power to control the way their parties act. So one thing I'm promising is that if the Canadian Future Party has a caucus after the next election, that we will manage our caucus that way, that there will be absolutely things where all MPs are expected to vote with the leader. Anything to do with the party platform. That's fair. You're elected on a platform. You should vote for it if you get the chance. It's a collective contract. Back to those collective responsibilities. Confidence motions to keep the government in power, totally fair to ask MPs to vote for that. But beyond that, anything apart from the budget, the throne speech, and platform commitments, it should be up to the leader to build a coalition. So that's an approach that we're going to take, and I'm going to do my best to push Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Trudeau that all their talk about democracy, here is something they can do today. It costs no money. It changes no laws. It's a question of ethics and values. And so they've got that.
I like
then
that.
The next one would be a broader structural issue, which would be our electoral system. That there are a lot of people, generally on the progressive side, who look at proportional representation and make claims for it that it is going to transform our system and it would somehow make everything better. I had the chance to participate in the drafting of the Constitution of Nepal following their revolution in 2006 when I was working there, and helped to draft a proportionally representative system that they used. Nepal is still not particularly well governed. All that creating a PR system did in that country and most others is it does give you a parliament that is more reflective of the will of the people. And to me, that's enough. We don't need to make highfalutin claims for why PR is better. A mixed member system where you've got most MPs elected the same way they are now, and then a small number from each province added on so that the vote totals in that province at least broadly reflect the will of the population, is an easy, unobtrusive way to make our parliament more representative. So that's going to be something you'll see. Not making huge claims, just it's just.
You mentioned also defined individual rights and collective responsibilities. Are you looking at reinterpreting the Charter of Rights, or is this something that you're going to be taking as given and just having a discussion about the Charter of Rights?
Yeah, I think it's we've got to start using the Charter. Something I was really surprised in my time as a cabinet minister was the deep fear that provincial governments and other stakeholders had in sending questions to the Supreme Court for reference. That if we have questions about the constitutionality of any piece of legislation in terms of its impact on individual or group rights, let's use the courts. It's literally what they're there for. And then those issues are settled, because then you can actually build a body of precedents and law that others can be inspired by. I've tried to introduce, and it lost by two votes in an open vote in the legislature, a bill to remove the religious exemptions for childhood vaccines in New Brunswick schools. This was before the pandemic. And at one point we were talking about, people were saying this is unconstitutional. Saying, okay, well, let's do a court reference and see whether or not it is. Anyway, it ended up being defeated, so it didn't get to that. But I think that's a mechanism that is underused, and if that mechanism starts to push us too much in the direction of having laws that are being more written than interpreted by judges, that's when you start to look at the Charter. But I don't think we've ever looked at it. We've never used it properly. We use it as this sort of almost religious totem that shows that, we are committed to individual rights. But when it comes to actually trying to lay out that messy, painful intersection between individual and group rights, we just don't do it. And that's part of why we've ended up by having this strange slide where, taking another contemporary example, the protests that we've seen in the last number of years, whether it's First Nations blockades, the convoy, folks protesting what's happening in Palestine, we've got to get back at some point to just say, this is against the law. I don't care what your cause is, but if we don't have laws that are actually enforced, then first we generally decrease the support for those particular political causes. So it's not a particularly good political strategy. And it just allows people from the opposing side to say, well, we broke the law without consequence, so why can't you did it? Why can't we do it as well?
It does bring up a case of selective enforcement, and then you see leaks through of who's actually controlling the police, and that becomes a big issue, doesn't it?
All right. I mean, it was something that, and I was in Toronto in the summertime and just went down to a protest that was, I'm going to say pro-Hamas, because it was, they were condemning the assassination by Israel of one of the Hamas leaders. So it was not a pro-Palestine protest. It was about Hamas. And there was 500 or 600 people there. I was there. I said, free Palestine from Hamas. I had no permit. Neither did the 500 or 600 people. But because my voice was conflicting with the others, I was arrested. And I have no issue. I knew that was a possibility when I joined that confrontation. I think civil disobedience, you should intentionally embrace being arrested, something I made me lose all respect for the convoy people beyond thinking their political project was misguided, their belief that somehow they had the right to break the law. We have the right to be arrested and treated fairly if we are protesting what we believe are unfair laws. But if we don't have the spine to put our own skin in the game and risk a few hours or days of our freedom to stand up for something we say is important, then we don't really think it's that important. And it sort of gets into that feeling these days of a lot of politics being a lot of cosplaying rather than actual serious activism or militancy.
Your item number 2 on the website was make democracy deliver by reforming government programs, by opening up to competition wherever possible, while guaranteeing universal public accessibility. And it also mentions the Hillier Plan to solve the housing crisis. Can you give just a brief intro to what this bullet means?
Sure. The Hillier Plan was around getting the federal government, the provinces, the armed forces to get as many houses built as quickly as possible. Canadians have no idea how close we came this spring to having our country fall apart. Give me 30 seconds on this.
All right.
Russia was pushing in Ukraine. We had 650, 700,000 people who have Canadian visas, Ukrainians who have Canadian visas, who were not in Canada. If Ukraine had seen significant losses, and we'd seen a significant flow of those folks who already had Canadian visas, they had every legal right to arrive in Canada before, I believe it was May 1st. We could have been facing, on top of the crisis caused by the mismanagement of our immigration system more broadly, we could have had a couple of 100,000 Ukrainians with nowhere to go. Wow. And we would have been absolutely sunk. There was literally no place for them to stay. And this was not being discussed. The plans for it, if there were any, were certainly not shared, even with key stakeholders in the sort of housing advocacy sector. So there was a moment where we could have had a serious societal disruption because we didn't plan on how to deliver on a promise that we'd made for all the right reasons. Totally support what we did to try and help Ukrainians. But that was an example. If that had happened, talk about a way to drive down support for Ukraine. Suddenly you've got tens of thousands of Canadians out on the street because new arrivals are getting spaces in, forget about houses, in hotels or wherever else. We would have been scrounging to find just horizontal places for people to sleep. So that was utterly irresponsible. So similarly, we're sitting here talking. So the other point around making democracy deliver for our social programs. Spent a lot of time the last couple of years since I quit cabinet over the rightward drift of the Higgs government in New Brunswick, talking to young people about politics and where they see the future of the country. And something that I found really interesting was that for voters, young people under 25, 30, especially those in universities still, huge resistance towards the idea of paying high levels of tax for a healthcare system that they cannot access. And that when they talk to their families, they say that their parents can't properly access it. And they're talking to people who told me stories about their grandparents not being able to get surgeries. And the list of complaints that we all hear about the healthcare system. But for young people who don't have, I'm 54, the memory of a system that worked better, when they hear people in my generation saying universal healthcare, all they hear is someone who's saying that give me your money so that I can give you nothing in return. And even for people who are a lot further away than I am towards the old left of the political spectrum, a lot of them were saying they didn't want to pay for that. So I think we've been, again, so privileged to live in a country where things are going so well that we often throw around words like programs failing and whatever else, that we forget those can be real. And if those failures start to be seen or felt even as close to universal, we are going to lose those programs.
So how do you fix the healthcare system?
So concrete solution that's going to be in the form we have in the form of a resolution for the convention this weekend. So it might not be passed, but it's an idea of this sort of approach. Our surgeons already work for public healthcare systems across the country through the provinces. Those surgeons are generally small business people. They run their own offices, they hire their own staff, they hire and fire. They are business people. They are not civil servants. So we always talk about our public healthcare system, but it depends on an enormous number of doctors and medical professionals who are not public servants. So given that's already existing, why don't we take the evenings and the weekends in our public hospitals when facilities that we pay for them to be heated, we pay for all the supplies, everything else, but they're going totally unused. Why not take doctors who already work in our public system, but who are already private business people, because that's just the reality, let them rent the space in our public hospital so money goes back into the public sector. They can charge a bit more if they want, but they're paying the province, and they're also taking someone off the provincial waiting list. So you're driving waiting lists down, putting more money in the provincial coffers, dealing with that huge backlog that causes knock-on effects because sick people get sicker and all the other things. So that's an example of taking the spirit of a public healthcare system and making sure we reinforce it using the powers of the market. You're not introducing private healthcare. You're just using our own facilities better and allowing staff we already have. We don't have enough staff. The ones we do have, at least letting them work harder to be able to take some pressure off the system. One of the reasons we lose doctors is because our doctors don't make the same cash they do in the States. The only country Canada has a full reciprocal medical agreement with is the US. So that's a one-way street. Most of the doctors in Canada go to the States. We don't see too many coming back the other way. So another thing we can do is work on foreign credential recognition, because those are federal responsibilities. That the feds can set some of those standards. We can change the Canada Health Act to allow that sort of competition that I just laid out. We can work with the regulatory bodies to tell them self-regulation is not supposed to be about being a trade union where you protect your members and keep competition away to keep prices high for your members. We need to let foreign trained doctors practice in Canada. It is so upsetting when I talk to people.
We have a huge shortage.
What's that?
We have a huge shortage of GPs. I mean, it's
absolutely, and we've got GPs driving people to Canadian hospitals. So I literally heard a story of a cancer doctor taking a cancer patient to a hospital where she was then told that she would not be able to access cancer care after having talked to an oncologist, her taxi driver who couldn't practice. And I'm not saying we should just take anyone who comes in off the boat and says they've got a doctor's degree, but we should absolutely have a system so that there can be accompaniment of newly arrived doctors and a testing system that as quickly as possible gets them into operating rooms, gets them into clinics. And something else there we can do is from the federal side, given the shortage of family doctors and that huge pressure that comes from the states because of salary differentials, rather than creating all these duplicative programs that take away from provincial responsibility, the federal government can do a salary top-up for family doctors. Easy, no fuss, no muss, can be done through the tax system, but it's a way of helping the provinces get better results. And the last thing on that is it is nuts that the federal government, after nearly 60 years of public health care, we still don't have a system for recognizing the credentials of doctors in New Brunswick who want to go to BC. A couple of the provinces have reciprocals. There needs to be a national license for family doctors. Indeed. And that means that those doctors should be able to move easily from province to province, territory to territory. And also, so should patients who currently right now have to deal with the weird 3-month waiting list where people often fall through the cracks and end up with bills that they'll usually eventually get paid, but they can be a real hardship. So there's a few concrete suggestions that will make the Canadian Medical Society possibly not particularly happy. Gets the folks who type anytime you talk about money in healthcare get extremely upset unless the money is directed to business people who happen to be called doctors for some reason. So let's just step back and go, the goal here is not to employ public servants. The goal is to provide Canadians with healthcare free and high quality on the point of delivery. This is a way of doing that, doing it faster, and using the resources that we have right now, even though they are quite limited, until we get those issues around credentials sorted out.
Okay. So your policy item number 3 is increase Canada's defense spending to 2% of GDP. That's pretty straightforward. The CFP plans include a universal citizens resiliency corps to support community vibrancy and disaster relief efforts in Canada. giving our young people skills, building our national identity, and allowing our armed forces to focus on national defense and global security. What do you mean in this case by universal? Is this a government-mandated service for young people?
That was the intention there. That's coming up again in a resolution this weekend. I will be supporting that. It's up to the delegates to decide. That's the one where there's more controversy because we're talking about it being mandatory. And we're talking about it being mandatory for a couple of reasons. First is referred to in the text you just read. One of the problems we're facing right now is that we're living in more and more of a virtual world where we have no opportunities to really engage in Canadian spaces. And people aren't learning about their country and people's challenges and what it means to be Canadian in any sense. And I'm very wary of directive approaches by government saying that this is what it means. But surely the best way to build a sense of national identity is for Canadians to have the chance to work together and talk with each other. So I think there's an important nation building component that Canada has ignored for far too long. And Mr. Trudeau's dreams of a post-national country, I don't think those are there. And we certainly don't. We see the rest of the world going in an aggressively different direction. I'd like to not waste time arguing about whether or not nation states exist. Let's talk about how Canada as a state can set a high standard in terms of its rights for individuals, the services it delivers. And that comes from having Canadians who have that shared set of values themselves. So on that, that's a sort of a philosophical reason that I think would have concrete and positive applications. Next level down, Germany today or yesterday introducing mandatory military service again. The Danes introduced it and extended it to women for the first time recently. There are countries across Europe nearly every week now reintroducing some form of national service. Our forces have been crying out for years saying that the federal government cannot continue to use the Canadian Armed Forces to work on fighting forest fires, cleaning up after snowstorms and floods. Our forces are supposed to be a fighting force. We have got to build up a structure recognizing the reality of climate change and the increasing numbers of natural disasters that are facing the country. We need a core that is able to respond to those needs without drawing down our ability to deploy our forces to be able to protect us and help our allies. So that's the goal there.
Well,
also,
is there an evidence base for the countries that we know of these European countries that do have mandated service, like the Swiss and the Danes, as you say? Is there any evidence of the impact of this that supports this as a successful program?
It is, because it's one of the most concrete ways you can demonstrate essentially that your country is taking military preparedness seriously. We have the data points of every single year of the Cold War when it was very clear that NATO was prepared to respond to the Warsaw Pact, with the Warsaw Pact being on the back foot and not being at all aggressive, except for in Afghanistan, which sort of ended them. Post the internal battles within the Warsaw Pact in Hungary in the 50s and Czechoslovakia in the 60s, Poland in the 80s, those battles were all internal. There were very little efforts to push anywhere west to try and infringe on democracies. And we had that sort of uneasy peace for a long time, which was awful because we condemned hundreds of millions of people to live behind the Iron Curtain and not enjoy the freedoms and all the benefits that we get here in the West. But once the Cold War ended and we started to draw down all of those defenses, the Russians have taken massive advantage of that. Russia would not be in Ukraine today if Ukraine was in NATO. Been very clear that NATO's membership in NATO is the best guarantee you can have against the Russians coming after you. They've gone against every other neighbor they've had, including and then some of their own internal republics, with Chechnya and whatever. So there's a real, absolutely evidence base there that demonstrating a clear willingness to defend yourself is the best defense against bullies. It's sadly the same basic biological precept that applies in elementary school playgrounds, where if bullies feel that they might get poked back, they're less likely to bully. And usually most bullies don't need to be poked more than once or twice before they stop.
Item number 4 on your list is restore faith in our immigration system. Surely an easy win there. The CFP agrees that Canada needs immigrants, and that means we need a system that works. How will you fix the system?
So this is obviously rapidly changing. There's not an election until next year. This is the Trudeau government's going to have to deal with the next stage of this disaster. We had an immigration system that was the envy of the world, and it depended on recognizing Canada's what the immigration folks call absorptive capacity. If you go beyond that, you start to create the problems you see in other countries that have issues around immigration, UK, US. Inexplicably, the Liberals decided to blow that nearly universal consensus behind immigration out of the water, and we have millions more people here in the last couple of years. And we've now Canadians have lost faith in the system. We've got newcomers who aren't being treated properly, who are saying terrible things about Canada back home. It's just a disaster for us all around. So if, assuming this hasn't happened by the time the election comes, if we have any say over what happens after that, we need to see a pause in the student and temporary foreign workers programs. We need to see them rejig to make sure that we can get temporary foreign workers in who can help us in the trades, because that's an area that we've totally ignored, despite the fact that we have this huge shortage across the country of electricians, plumbers, everything, pretty much all of the trades, which gets back into another issue. We devalued the trades over decades for no real reason, because we were sort of part of that post-World War II ethos that going to university was a good thing for just about everyone. Unfortunately, we reduced the quality of our K-12 system. Lots of people go to university and then come out the other side without the skills, or really more important, the knowledge of what they want to do with their lives, which has got to be the biggest tragedy if a system spends billions of dollars and the people who go through it still don't know that. So we need to encourage immigration first from countries where we can hopefully have better relationships. So you'll see throughout the Canadian Future Party's approach, we're talking about trading, working with, defending other democracies. Let's try and get as many of our standards in line with other democracies as possible. The poorer ones, we can help boost them up. We can have people come here, work in different professions, then go back home. Canadians can go there. Let's figure out places that match the needs that we have and work to build a partnership that works better for everyone. So that can easily be done. The problem is that we've now built in this expectation around, with our companies, huge numbers of immigrants coming every year and working in these temporary programs, which are fundamentally abusive. So that's an area where I'm a bit more lefty. I'm just saying, you want to pay people and work in Canada, you pay Canadians and you pay them Canadian salaries. If you can't do that, then go out of business. The market is a powerful force, but the market, if it's covered up by government protectionism, gives you the worst of the left and the worst of the right. So we need to make sure people have got social programs so they can get back on their feet if they fail. But this idea that somehow it's okay to exploit underpaid foreigners and deprive Canadians of jobs so that we can continue to prop up any business is, I think, gets back to that original point we were chatting about, values and policies. Our values at some point have to kick in and say, I don't care whether this is cost effective. It's wrong. We're a country. We have a responsibility first to each other so that we can generate the wealth that we need to be able to help other people. But that's got to start with a clear recognition of the need to make sure that Canadians can get work and immigrants, when they arrive here, can get work.
So morally, I agree with you, but practically this means that all of our clothing is going to be made at 2 or 3 times the cost.
It is, but that is something which, if we're going to, right now, we would not accept it. Well, after what happened on Tuesday, who knows? But I would guess most Canadians would probably be unhappy if there were slave factories in Michigan filled with Mexicans building cheap clothes to sell at Joe Fresh. Why do we accept that when those slave laborers are Muslims in China? Why do we accept it when they're people from other classes and castes in other countries where they receive?
I agree 100% with you. I just think that society is going to need a big kick to swallow that pill.
It is, but that's a part of this. What I'm trying to do with this party is we need to have that conversation about that big kick. The soft world that grew up because of the sacrifice made in the first half of the 20th century, that world is dead. We squandered our world leadership. We squandered the moral authority we had, the ability to raise other countries out of poverty more intentionally than we did. And the fact that so many people did rise out of poverty because of Western money is great. But the fact that we allowed the Chinese to take our intellectual property and cash and build a system that they are now using the wealth and technology that they got and took from us to weaponize it and fling it back at us at the same time as they perfect tools of oppression against their own people. We should be morally offended at ourselves for what we did there. And we need to get back to talking a little bit more about, again, morality and values. I don't give a damn who you sleep with or who you love. I do absolutely care if you're taking part of your paycheck and using it to support slave labor. And that's excellent. We've got to start having those conversations. Canada's, yes, we're far away from some of these conflicts, but the world is getting ever smaller and ever more alarming. So it'd be nice if we could take a position that we could be proud of. And if we get ahead of this, the Chinese have already said they are decoupling from the West. They've given themselves, depending on which official you listen to coming out of the party Congress a couple of years back now, they're saying within the next 5 to 10 years, full removal of dependence on the Western democracies for trade. They are building an alliance of autocracies to support their economy. Mm-hmm. We can choose now to get ahead of that and try and build trade relations with countries that are lower income than us, to provide us with some of those consumer goods that they can produce in those countries without employing slave labor, but still keeps them more competitive, and have a slow rising up. We can either do that intentionally with us in charge, or we can wait until the Chinese invade Taiwan, cut off our supply of computer chips and cheap clothes, and leave us fighting in the dark about how we can't afford to put clothes back anymore. It's our choice. We can either be in control of our destinies or not, or at least try to be.
So item 5, make life more affordable and increase incomes. Perfect. You've sampled each end of the political spectrum in your career and have arrived at the solution. Great. The CFP will dismantle the protectionism that sees our political parties cozy up with big business, big labor, and foreign dictatorships to fix prices. We'll open our telecommunications, airlines, and agricultural sectors to competition. This will certainly bring prices down, but it'll also mean Canadian farmers and industries will have to compete against foreign entities that are getting juicy handouts from their governments.
Not necessarily, because again, why don't we have the ambition and the courage to say, no, we're not going to do that. If you want access, here are our conditions for free trade, that we're not going to let you in if you are massively subsidizing your sector. But it's also equally, I'm not interested in hearing protectionist arguments in a country where we are paying more for our cell phone services and more for airline tickets than anywhere else in the world. It's insane. It costs me more money to fly from Fredericton to here in Ottawa than it does most of the time to fly from Ottawa, return trip to Bangkok. That's mad. And I can get to anywhere in Southeast Asia and then fly around the region for $100. Life isn't defined by low-cost air travel, but in a country as vast as Canada, if we want to, again, talk about trying to build some sense of national cohesion, making it so you don't have to give up a significant proportion of your annual salary just to go and visit your parents in another province would be a nice step. And that, to me, would, again, when you talk about values, I am not particularly concerned about the executives at Air Canada and the makeup of the ownership of that company. I'm very concerned that Canadians can't see other Canadians. So I think, again, we've got to not let business sectors wrap themselves in the flag and claim that they are the representatives of Canada. Canadians are the ones who are being screwed by the fact that airline tickets are unaffordable and cell phone prices are insane. On the agricultural sector, that's one where we are completely aware of the dangers of international competition killing our farms, and the absolute requirement, because of all the other stuff we've been talking about, to have a strategic agricultural land reserve that is defended and used properly. We cannot keep on giving away our prime farming land and having it being developed. There's got to be a balance there with building up density in our urban areas rather than the sprawl that's too often defined. Yeah, it's natural. Canada's a huge country, so we tend to just move outwards rather than up because it costs less.
How do you stop U.S. dumping of subsidized food under the NAFTA agreement? Are you going to stop back out of NAFTA, or are you going to institute tariffs, and then we have the softwood tariffs on the other side, and we have a trade war? How do we? The details of the idea is great, but the details are missing.
Well, there's a trade war coming, right? The trade war was elected on Tuesday, and so we're going to we're almost certainly going to be in a position of having, based on what I'm hearing, renegotiate the free trade deal with the U.S. and Mexico again. I gather that there's a desire from the Trump team side to reopen those discussions. So we're going to need to establish our lines in the sand around some of those issues. It's an opportunity from my perspective. It's a horrible opportunity. I wish we weren't having to face the possibility of our major trading partner spiraling off out of control. But we need to, again, as I was saying, around decoupling ourselves from slave labor in the global economy, we've got to break our dependence on the United States in some of these areas as well, that we have a globalized economy and have not taken enough advantage of it and have continued to rely on the easy trade, north-south. It's putting us in an incredibly difficult position, as any country is if they're nearly completely dependent on another. So absolutely, we would, if we had any input into those negotiations, be talking about how if there's not going to be, you can't complain about protectionist structures on one side if they exist on the other. You can't claim that an absence of federal protectionism somehow mitigates state level protection, that there has to be a clear description of what the playing field looks like. But because Canada's position has been so tied for so long, I mean, we saw what happened when a Conservative leader tried to go against the Quebec agricultural interests. And Mr. Scheer was quickly replaced with Mr. Poilievre, whose right-wing populism does not extend to ending protectionism in those sectors. And that's because he's looking out for his political survival. Those groups are incredibly powerful politically. But again, if we want to maintain support for Canadian industries, I do not think that is going to be possible in the medium term if that equates directly to paying a whole lot more in exchange for not getting a lot more choice. I think we can build a much fairer playing field if Canada starts to negotiate free trade deals with other democracies, smaller ones, that have things that we need. In many cases, that's going to be just human resources. It's going to be the people with skills in certain areas. When I was education minister, my guy who succeeded me followed up on this. We're working on programs in both Morocco and Tunisia, which are moderate Muslim countries, have lots of people who speak French and English and Arabic, which is always useful, even as New Brunswick's doesn't have a lot of Arabic speakers, but more all the time. And those governments have government departments to help young Tunisians and Moroccans move to other countries. They'll even pay part of their salaries and costs for a few years. New Brunswick was the first province that had tried to take up those countries on those offers. That makes no sense. We've got to be a little bit bolder and work a bit harder, and not just look to the US as our default for every single contract, every single new product. There are so many places that we can build partnerships with where we will have the advantage of being the wealthier, more established jurisdiction, and we can get a good deal, a deal that'll help those partners and help us as well. So I think it's being a bit more creative, a bit more brave, and looking beyond the US, recognizing the US is going through its, whatever you want to call it, special moment right now. And again, it'd be nice if we'd been a little bit better prepared for Tuesday night's result. Hopefully there are people who are working on making sure that, to your point, we have some plan for how we handle a trade war, how we handle an influx of immigrants coming from the US, potentially people who are escaping possible deportation, given the president-elect's plans to deport millions and millions of people. These are going to have massive destabilizing impacts in our country starting in a few months' time. Wow. And it comes back to one of my reasons for starting this party, is my frustration with Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Trudeau for never being honest with Canadians about how we have these multiple tsunamis all crashing on us at the same time, and also at the same time as our own we have this crisis of confidence in our own ability to actually get anything done. And our institutions all a little bit creaky because they've been so successful for so long. They need an overhaul. But,
we need a rational view of the issues. So we're running under time, but I really appreciate you spending the time with us today to discuss the Canadian Future Party and your plans for it. And good luck on your meeting with your caucus or with your members. Just a last question. It seems like we're going to be having an election soon. Are you planning on fielding a full slate of candidates in the next federal election?
That'll be based on the evidence, because we have a very high standard for our candidates. We're the only party that has a requirement that all candidates be Canadian citizens, or anyone who votes for our candidates, rather. So to be a voting member of the party, you have to be a citizen, so that you don't end up with what I saw in New Brunswick when we talked about expanding voting rights in provincial elections to permanent residents. I had Chinese nationals, Chinese Canadians going, please don't do this. The second that you give me the rights of a Canadian without the protections of a Canadian, I'm going to be abused by my home government. So things like that, where we are doing our best to really be quite different. An incredibly detailed vetting process because we are concerned about foreign interference. That said, it's going to be up to Canadians. If they like our message, get involved. Look us up online, Canadian Future Party, and we're looking for candidates, people to get involved across the country. After this weekend, we're going to be going through the fun process of building up hundreds of riding associations from coast to coast to coast, and then looking for candidates. So we hope to have as full a slate as we can. But for us, the most important thing is having folks who Canadians could look at and go, yeah, I want this as one of the 300 odd people who's going to be managing this multi-billions and billions of dollars worth of a country and all the programs involved and the moral responsibilities that go with it. So we view this as a serious job and not something that just anyone should get involved with. We need to reestablish standards in politics. This is not an easy job. Shouldn't be, let's make sure we hire people based on that. The party has a job to do to make sure that it gives people some good choices. We've seen what happens when parties don't take that responsibility in the US with Mr. Trump's rise. Parties are filtering mechanisms. We take that job seriously.
Well, thank you very much for the interview, Mr. Cardy, and good luck with the Canadian Future Party.
Hey, thanks. We'll need it. Take care. Talk to you soon.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.